Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The hotel's lingering shadows. I work overnight at a large, older hotel nestled in the heart of a downtown metropolis. As the night audit clerk, I spend most of my shifts in the quiet lobby, managing the books while the rest of the building falls into stillness. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal or anything beyond the natural world, but I've always had a lingering curiosity about the unknown. Personally, I haven't seen anything too strange during my time here, but the stories passed around by co-workers, especially the ones working security or back of house, have painted a different picture of what goes on during these dark hours. Our hotel is a towering skyscraper with over 20 floors above ground and several below. The grand ballroom lies 2 levels beneath street level, and there are several more ballrooms and event rooms situated on the 2nd floor, just above the lobby. The 3rd floor holds meeting rooms, and the very top floor is entirely reserved for banquets and large events. Guest rooms begin on the 4th floor and stretch all the way to the floor just below that final event space. At night, the event spaces lie in eerie silence, dormant and empty, though our security team continues their rounds to ensure nothing strange has taken up residence. Occasionally they find a guest who got lost, or more rarely, a homeless person who found their way inside and tried to sleep in a quiet corner. But it's not the ordinary disruptions that keep our staff on edge. It's the moments when everything seems perfectly normal, yet something feels off. The 3rd floor is especially unsettling for the guards, who often admit they feel watched while walking alone there. Despite the lights being constantly on, and despite it being entirely devoid of guests at night, multiple employees have spoken of a heavy unease that settles over them the moment they step onto that floor. Over the years, several have described hearing the distant, unmistakable giggle of a little girl, or catching a fleeting glimpse of a child just out of view. Interestingly, many of these employees had never worked together or even met, yet their descriptions of the girl were uncannily similar. Some have come to believe that a young spirit lingers on that level, watching quietly from the corners. But the girl is not the only presence people speak of. There's something else on the 3rd floor, something that makes people's stomachs drop and their instincts scream to flee. Even those who don't believe in ghosts hesitate to do their rounds there, and no one likes being alone in the north stairwell. That particular staircase, one of 2 in the building, has its own legend. The story goes that decades ago, a little boy fell from the top floor of the north stairwell and tragically lost his life. Ever since, numerous reports, some from guests, some from staff, have described hearing the pattering footsteps of a child running up and down the stairs, followed by laughter and whispers. No one has ever found records of such an accident, but the consistency of the reports has kept the legend alive. It's easy to dismiss it as imagination or superstition, but the sheer volume of people who claim to have experienced it, housekeepers, banquet workers, engineers, makes you wonder. Then, there's the story of the shadow person. A former security guard, known for his skepticism and for not believing anything he couldn't see or touch, had an encounter that changed him. He was assigned to do his patrols in the top event floor late one night, and as usual, he opted to keep the lights off to maintain a tactical advantage in case he encountered anyone unauthorized. His flashlight was his only guide through the darkness. He had done this many times before, relying on his memory of the layout and his strong night vision. But that night, something was different. As he swept the beam of his flashlight across the wide, empty ballroom, he caught sight of a human silhouette standing in front of the large window overlooking the city. The figure was sharply outlined by the glow of the skyline behind it. Thinking it was a trespasser or possibly a lost guest, he decided to creep closer to surprise them and take control of the situation. He approached slowly and cautiously, eyes locked on the unmoving figure. 15 feet away, he raised his flashlight and flicked it on, expecting to catch the person in the beam, but there was nothing. No one stood at the window. There was only the reflection of his own light against the glass and the still dust particles floating gently in the air. The figure had vanished. Bewildered, he swept the beam left and right. Convinced his eyes had played tricks on him, he walked up to the spot where the figure had stood and looked out over the glittering cityscape. But the feeling of being watched crept up his spine. Just as he turned to leave, his heart dropped. The door he had entered through, which had been shut behind him, was now ajar, and silhouetted in its frame was the same figure, this time more solid, with a pair of glowing red eyes staring straight at him. He froze in terror as the shadowy shape slowly backed out of the room, never breaking eye contact. Then the door closed gently, sealing the darkness in. Shaken, the guard raced back to the lobby and recounted what had happened to me and 2 other co-workers. His skin was pale, his voice trembling, and we had never seen him like that before. Curious but cautious, we took turns going up to check the floor ourselves. With the lights off, the space was unnerving, a thick tension hanging in the air. We didn't see anything, but we all admitted to feeling watched, and that same creeping dread began to take root in us. From that night on, the guard refused to do his patrols without the lights on, and eventually he asked to be transferred to a different building. Something up there had scared him to his core. I've only had one personal encounter that I can't quite explain, though it's subtle enough that you might write it off as electrical issues. I was covering the BPX phone operator station one night while my co-worker was on break. The phones usually ring a few times during the overnight shift, wake-up calls, late-night food inquiries, maybe someone wanting to book a room at 3 a.m. But occasionally we get what we call ghost calls. These aren't prank calls or wrong numbers. They come from specific rooms, always the same few. The line rings, I answer, and all I hear is either static or dead silence. Then the line cuts, and the room keeps calling, again and again, even if it's unoccupied. Sometimes it goes on for hours, and if there is someone in the room, they always say they didn't make the call. I remember one operator who, new to the job, tried calling one of the ghost rooms back after receiving 3 or 4 silent calls. The guest answered and insisted they hadn't touched the phone all night, but the calls continued. Even when those rooms were vacant and the lines were supposed to be inactive, they kept calling. Engineering has checked everything multiple times. The wiring, the switches, the phone systems, all supposedly normal. And yet, the calls persist. I've been at this hotel long enough to memorize the list of rooms that do this, and I get a chill every time I see their numbers flash on the display. Maybe it's just a glitch, some kind of wiring anomaly in this old building. But even if that's the case, it doesn't explain the timing, or why guests in those rooms report hearing strange tapping, or feeling like they're not alone. The truth is, no matter how much we try to explain it all away, there's an undeniable energy in this building, especially at night. People say old hotels collect stories, that their walls absorb the lives and memories of those who pass through. Maybe that's all this is, memories echoing through the floors, replaying themselves again and again like a broken record. Or maybe it's something more. I've learned that just because something doesn't make sense doesn't mean it's not happening, and sometimes the strangest experiences make for the best stories. Whether it's real or imagined, logical or otherworldly, the nights in this hotel always hold something just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. Story 2. The church sound that shouldn't exist. Years ago, I used to work as the head sound engineer at a church, which for the most part was a daytime job. Most of my responsibilities centered around Sunday services and weekday events, but there were other tasks that didn't rely on the clock. One of those jobs was duplicating CDs of sermons for people who wanted copies to listen to at home or in their cars. These requests were often lengthy, sometimes entire series spanning multiple months, which meant I had to squeeze in extra time to fulfill them. Being a night owl, I found it peaceful to return to the church after midnight to complete these quiet duties. On one particular night, sometime around 1 or 2 a.m., I let myself in with my key. The church was completely dark, but I knew the layout so well that I didn't need any lights. The soft glow of streetlights outside gave me just enough visibility to find my way through the halls and up to the sound booth, which was nestled in a balcony overlooking the sanctuary. The church itself had a large, open sanctuary with rows of pews leading up to the stage. Above it was a single balcony where the sound booth was located. There was only one entrance to that balcony, a door in the foyer and a staircase leading up, and once inside you had a completely unobstructed view of the sanctuary below. The room was acoustically precise, allowing even a whisper on stage to travel clearly to the back wall. I'd spent hundreds of hours in that church, many of them alone, and it had always been a place of quiet familiarity for me. I never felt threatened, never uneasy, and certainly never fearful, until that night. I turned on the single overhead bulb above the sound booth and got to work. The rest of the church remained dark. The CD duplicator whirred softly, the hum a comforting background sound as I lost myself in thought, focused on the task. It had been just over an hour when I heard it, subtle but distinct. A soft clink, clink, coming from the middle rows of pews below me on the left-hand side. It was an unmistakable sound to someone like me, familiar with every corner and every ritual of the church. That gentle sound of ceramic coffee mugs lightly tapping together. Our church had a coffee area that served beverages in basic ceramic mugs every Sunday morning, and those mugs would often be left behind in the sanctuary. Baristas or volunteers would collect them later, and when they were carried by the handles in bunches, they would make that exact sound. It was so familiar, in fact, that I had long since stopped noticing it during daytime services. But in the silence of that vast room, under the dim light, in the middle of the night, the sound stood out like a gunshot. Confused, I stood up and peered into the darkness, trying to spot any movement or glint of reflection. Curiosity eventually got the better of me, and I decided to go investigate. I descended the stairs into the foyer, flipped on the main sanctuary lights, and began my search. There were indeed a few mugs left from Sunday services, scattered in the pews and underneath seats, but what I noticed immediately is that they were far apart, none close enough to another to have made contact and created the sound I had heard. I got on my hands and knees to look underneath the pews, just to be sure. Everything was still. No movement, no disturbance. It was like the sound had never happened at all. I stood up, puzzled, and decided to return to the balcony. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a stray sound, a forgotten detail I'd misremembered. I turned off the sanctuary lights, leaving just the single light above the sound booth, and returned to work. No more than 15 minutes later, the sound returned. Clink, clink, the same as before, from the exact same spot. The hair on my neck stood up as a chill swept through my body. I froze for a long moment, eyes scanning the dark sanctuary, heart racing with an odd mix of fear and wonder. This time, I didn't even bother turning the lights back on. I went downstairs and flipped on just one of the sanctuary lights, the one closest to the pews where I'd heard the sound. I walked down the aisle again, slowly, carefully, listening with every step. Silence. Once again, there was no logical explanation. No mugs had moved. Nothing was out of place. There were no animals, no drafts, no vibrations from outside. Just silence, and a creeping sense of something unseen, watching from the dark. From that point on, I started to leave lights on when I returned to the balcony. It made me feel a little safer, though I didn't truly believe I was in any danger, just unsettled. The half hour passed, and I had almost convinced myself that the night would end quietly. Then, for the third time, the sound rang out again. This time louder, clearer. It was coming from the same location, and this time, it didn't stop. It was repetitive, rhythmic. I looked down into the pews and saw nothing, no movement. Just the echo of that familiar clink. This wasn't just unsettling anymore, it was becoming something else entirely. My logic started to fail me. There was no mechanical explanation, no physical chain of events I could map in my mind to create that sound under those conditions. And yet, it continued. Still, I didn't run. I focused on finishing the CD duplication, pushing the sounds out of my mind, determined to finish what I had come there to do. The repetitive clinking went on for nearly half an hour before it stopped again, just as suddenly as it had started. I let the silence settle in. I even convinced myself, again, that the worst was over, that it had to have been some odd acoustics, maybe a draft, a vibration, anything. Then, just as I was getting ready to wrap up for the night, everything changed. Without warning, the entire sanctuary began to shake. A low, thunderous rumble filled the space, and I felt the vibrations through the floor, through my feet, through my chest. It was like the building itself was groaning from within. There are no earthquakes in this part of the country. I immediately ruled that out. I looked at the soundboard's LED display, the volume monitor. It was maxed out in the red, completely overloaded. But the microphones were unplugged, the amps were off, the speakers weren't connected, and even if they had been, the entire system was muted. Still, the board showed a full blast of input, like it was picking up something deafening. I checked everything again. No signal source, no feedback loops, no equipment failure that could explain it. For 30 long seconds, the room shook, and then it stopped. Just like that. Total silence. I stood there, stunned, frozen by the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Nothing else occurred that night. I packed up my things and left as quickly and quietly as I could. Since that night, I've gone back to the church many times. I've never heard the mugs clinking again. I've never felt the floor tremble. I've never seen the soundboard light up like that without explanation. I've tried telling myself that it was just a malfunction, an odd string of electrical issues, maybe stress, maybe a lack of sleep, but every time I remember the sheer clarity of that sound, the unmistakable ceramic echo and the terrifying pulse of energy that filled that sanctuary, I know in my gut that it was real. Something was there. I can't explain it. I don't need to. It happened, and that's enough. Now, whenever I'm alone in the dark and the silence begins to stretch too long, I think about that night, about the clinking sound that didn't belong, and I wonder if the church ever truly goes quiet after the lights go out. Story 3, the hospital's silent screams. I worked overnight security at one of the largest, oldest hospitals in the United States, a sprawling medical campus with buildings that had stood for over a century. My shifts typically involved walking quiet halls, checking doors, responding to false alarms, and occasionally assisting staff with minor disturbances. For the most part, it was routine work, long stretches of silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft sounds of distant machines. But there was one building, one place on the campus that made even the most seasoned officers uneasy. It was the original psychiatric facility, built in the late 1800s, and though it had long since been converted into office space, its history lingered in the very walls. This building didn't just feel old, it felt heavy, like it was burdened with everything it had witnessed, everything it had absorbed from the people who once suffered there. It was where whispers carried too far, where footsteps echoed longer than they should, and where the air itself seemed to shift depending on who entered. The psych building had become notorious among our staff. Some officers refused to take rounds in it. Others joked about its haunted halls, but always with a nervous laugh that betrayed a deeper discomfort. When I was first assigned to patrol it, I didn't think much of it. I'd heard the stories, of course, everyone had, but I assumed most of it was exaggeration. Still, I took note when other officers warned me. They said doors would unlock themselves, that whispering voices would call from behind closed rooms, and that people had seen figures moving through empty hallways. On my first night patrolling that building, I kept my expectations grounded. I did a full sweep of all the floors, making sure everything was secure before beginning my door checks. The building was dark, the kind of oppressive dark that seemed to swallow even the strongest flashlight beam, and the narrow halls made every footstep feel louder than it should have. The last door on the top floor was at the end of a hallway beyond 2 sets of swinging doors. I checked it, found it locked, and turned around to begin heading back. That's when I stopped cold. Every single office door I had just checked, every door I had just seen locked, was now standing ajar. Not wide open, just cracked. Each one opened exactly the same amount, as if something had moved through and nudged them open one by one. At the far end of the hallway, a single wheelchair sat in the center of the corridor, pointed toward the stairwell. It hadn't been there before. It had been silent when I walked that hall. There was no sound of creaking doors, no movement, nothing. But now the entire scene had shifted, rearranged like a stage set for something I couldn't see. My heart pounded, but I didn't run. I backed away slowly, my mind scrambling for explanations. Drafts? Faulty latches? A prank? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just missed something, or that something had just missed me. Later that week, I was assigned to patrol the old children's ICU, which was undergoing renovations. The construction workers had gone home for the night, and I was supposed to make sure no one was wandering into dangerous areas. Other officers had reported seeing a young boy in this section, a child, maybe 5 to 7 years old, with a bowl-cut hairstyle, always spotted alone in the half-built halls. I'd chalked it up to nerves and imagination until the foreman radioed that a child had somehow locked himself in one of the construction rooms. Concerned about the tools and wiring, I rushed over and unlocked the door. The room was bare, empty. We searched for 10 minutes, but there was no sign of the boy. It wasn't the first report of him, and it wouldn't be the last. But in that moment, it became real for me. Whatever people were seeing, it was consistent. Always the same boy, always vanishing before anyone could reach him. Then came the third event, the one that rattled me deeper than anything else. I was on special detail, posted in the psych ward to observe a violent patient. There were 2 of us on shift. The patient was asleep when I arrived, but a few hours into the night, he stirred, looked around, and greeted my partner by name. Then he saw me. His entire demeanor changed. He began screaming, pleading for me not to hurt him. I stood there confused. I hadn't said a word, hadn't moved. But he was panicked, shouting that if I promised not to harm him, something good would happen. I played along, told him I wouldn't hurt him. And just like that, he calmed down and went back to sleep. I tried to laugh it off, but the next day I was transferred to a permanent round with a small promotion, something I hadn't even applied for. It was probably a coincidence, but something about the way that patient had said it, so certain, like he had seen something coming, stuck with me. One of the most disturbing incidents came from a fellow officer during his patrol in that same psychiatric building. I heard his voice crackle over the radio, a raw, desperate plea for backup, his voice trembling with something deeper than fear. I was close and rushed to respond. When I found him, he was crouched on the floor, head in his hands, silently crying. A shattered chandelier lay in pieces a few feet from him. He later explained, barely able to get the words out, that he'd been frozen in place, unable to move, as the chandelier above him began to sway violently on its own. He said something unseen was holding him there, keeping him locked in place, until the moment it broke loose and crashed down. Only then had he been able to move and scramble away. His panic was real, and I had to help him back to our supervisor. When we told her what had happened, she just sighed and muttered, "Almost lost another one to that building." Apparently the other supervisor already knew. "That's why we send the new guys," he said. "I don't even like going in there myself." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know what else they weren't telling us. That building had a presence, an echo of something long buried but never gone. The patients who had suffered there, the experimental treatments, the forgotten cries, all of it felt like it had stained the very structure. Every brick, every window, every creaky stair held onto those memories like scars that never healed. Whether it was trauma soaked into the walls or something else entirely, I couldn't say. But I do know that whatever haunts that place doesn't care who believes in it or not. It doesn't show itself to skeptics to change their minds. It just waits, watches, moves things, whispers, freezes your body while your mind screams to move. And it never does the same thing twice. There's an understanding among the night shift that you don't mess with that building. If it's on your rounds, you keep your head down and your patrol short. You don't linger. You don't try to explain the sounds or movements. You check your doors, you finish your sweep, and you get out. The guys who try to be brave, who laugh off the stories and go exploring, they're always the first to get rattled. They're the ones who come back pale, who start asking to be reassigned, who don't come back to the job at all. The ones who treat it with quiet respect, those are the ones who last. It's like the building knows when it's being mocked, and it doesn't take kindly to arrogance. I eventually left that job. I moved on to a quieter post, a newer building with fewer stories, but I still think about that place. I still think about the moment I saw all those doors open behind me, perfectly still, like a row of open eyes. I think about that child who kept showing up on cameras, always alone, never moving quite right. I think about my fellow officer crouched on the floor, too shaken to speak, and the supervisor's casual reaction like it was all just part of the job. And I wonder what else happened in that building that no one talks about. What's never been written down. What was buried with the patients who never left. Some buildings are more than just walls and floors. Some places carry the weight of what they've witnessed. They don't forget. They don't forgive. And when the lights go out and the hallways fall quiet, they start to remember. If you listen closely, you might hear them. In the creak of a door that should have stayed closed. In the flicker of a light that no one touched. In the whisper of footsteps down an empty corridor. They speak in silence, in dread, in moments that leave no trace, but leave you changed forever. And the longer you spend walking those dark halls, the more you begin to understand that something is walking them with you. Story 4. The silent observer in the sound booth. It all started on a crisp winter night when I volunteered to head into the church to take care of a simple task, duplicating sermon CDs for congregants who had requested copies. I was the head sound engineer, and while most of my duties were performed during the day, sometimes smaller jobs like these were best handled when the sanctuary was quiet. I had done this many times before and never thought twice about going in late. The church was peaceful at night, and I often found it comforting to be alone in that vast space, with only the low hum of the CD duplicator and the dim glow of one overhead light to accompany me. I knew the building so well that I never needed more than that single bulb over the sound booth. I didn't even bother flipping on the lights below in the sanctuary, as the moonlight spilling through the stained glass windows offered just enough illumination to guide my way. The sanctuary itself was massive. The pews stretched back in even rows, and the stage was raised high enough for anyone in the back to see clearly. Above the main floor, at the very rear of the room, was the balcony, and nestled in that balcony was the sound booth. It provided a panoramic view of the space below, and perfect acoustics that allowed even the softest whisper on stage to carry. That night, I made my way up the narrow staircase into the booth and turned on the single bulb that hung overhead. It bathed the room in a soft golden light, just enough to see the controls, and begin the task of duplicating the requested sermons. It felt routine. It felt normal. But something that night was not quite right. As I worked, a strange sound echoed up from the sanctuary. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Clink, clink, like ceramic coffee mugs tapping together. The sound was familiar. Every Sunday morning, the church operated a small coffee area where volunteers would distribute drinks in simple ceramic mugs. That subtle clink was a background noise I'd heard thousands of times and had long since filtered out, but in the silence of the sanctuary, that sound became surreal. There was no one else in the church, no baristas gathering mugs, no parishioners chatting after service. Just me, alone in the dark, with that sound drifting up from below like an echo from a different time. I froze for a moment, unsure of what I had heard. Then it came again. Clink, clink, deliberate, repetitive, unmistakable. Curiosity pushed me to investigate. I left the booth, descended the stairs and flipped on the main sanctuary lights. I walked slowly through the pews, scanning for any mugs left behind. Over the years, they would often be forgotten under seats or tucked behind hymnals. I found a few, as expected, but they were far apart, nowhere near close enough to have clinked against one another. I bent down, checked underneath every row, and found nothing unusual. The mugs weren't touching. There was no breeze, no explanation. It made no sense. But I was satisfied enough with the silence and returned to the balcony, turning off the lights behind me, leaving only that one single bulb above the booth, burning quietly in the darkness. And just as I settled back into my seat, it happened again. Clink, clink, the exact same sound from the exact same place. The hairs on my arms stood on end and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I listened, heart thudding in my chest, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. I had just checked. The mugs were too far apart. No one was there. And yet, the sound continued, like someone unseen was picking them up and tacking them together in an idle, rhythmic gesture. This time, I didn't turn off the light in the sanctuary. I left it on and walked to the room once more. Everything was in place. Nothing had moved. The mugs were exactly where I had seen them before. I was alone, but the sound was real. Too real. I returned to the balcony, now with both the sanctuary and booth lights on, and locked the door behind me. It was an old habit, one I rarely used, but that night, something compelled me to secure the space. Maybe it was irrational, maybe I was just spooked, but it felt necessary. I resumed my task, trying to drown out the uneasy silence with the mechanical whirring of the CD duplicator. 30 minutes passed. The lights stayed on. The sound did not return. I started to relax again, thinking it had passed. Thinking maybe it had been a trick of the building settling, or some unexplained draft. Then, without warning, the world seemed to break open beneath me. The entire sanctuary began to shake, not a slight tremble or soft vibration, but a deep, rumbling quake that felt like it was rising from the floor itself. I grabbed the edge of the soundboard for support, eyes wide, heart racing. The soundboard's LED meters lit up, every bar peaking in red. It was maxed out, signaling a deafening input from the microphones. But the mics were disconnected. The amps were off. There were no speakers, and even if there had been, the system was muted. Still, the board screamed silently in red, as if capturing a sound so loud the equipment itself couldn't handle it. It made no sense. I knew that board. I knew how it worked. This was impossible. For 30 long seconds, the church roared with invisible force. And then, just like that, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, trembling, my mind unable to make sense of what had just happened. There had been no one in the sanctuary, nothing that could have triggered the system, no logical explanation for what I had seen and felt. I didn't finish the CDs, I didn't turn off the lights. I walked out of that church and into the cold night air without looking back. I didn't tell anyone the full story, only vague pieces. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, that they would. Since that night, I've been back to the church many times, but I've never gone in alone after dark again. The mugs never clinked again, the board never maxed out again, but the memory stays with me, vivid and sharp, like a wound that never fully heals. I've tried to explain it away with logic, with science, with reason, but nothing fits. Nothing explains the sound, the force, the precision. It wasn't just in my head. It wasn't just fear, it was real. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and the world is still, I hear the faintest echo in the back of my mind. Clink, clink. And I remember what it felt like to be watched by something I couldn't see. Something ancient and silent, observing from the dark. Story 5. The Locked Door at Calfman Hall. This story was told to me by a friend during our freshman year of college, and even though I wasn't there to experience it firsthand, it has stayed with me ever since. It was the fall of 2010, and I had just started attending a small university in Iowa. The school was quaint and quiet, said to be the oldest college in the state, though I never verified that claim. Like many students away from home for the first time, I quickly got caught up in the party scene, but it didn't take long before I got caught drinking underage. Most people who got busted would just pay a fine, but since I was one of the first to be caught that semester, the administration decided to make an example of me. My punishment was a bit humiliating. I had to spend a Saturday night sitting in the dorm lobby with a campus security guard, a kind of public shaming to warn other students. It was awkward at first, especially because the guard assigned to watch me was the same one who had written me up. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Terry. Terry seemed gruff at first, but once we started talking, he turned out to be a decent guy. He told me he used to be a state trooper but had switched to campus security for a more stable, less dangerous lifestyle. He had been working night shifts at the university for almost a decade by the time I met him. We chatted for a while, and the conversation naturally drifted to the strange things he had seen while working alone at night. The college had a handful of very old buildings, structures that looked like they belonged in a Gothic novel. The kind of places where legends form easily. Some of the dorms and administrative offices had stories attached to them. Ghosts in the halls, unexplained noises, lights that flickered even when no one was around. I didn't put much stock in ghost stories back then, but something about the way Terry changed as he began telling me one specific tale made me stop joking and start listening. He told me that during his second year on the job, a building on campus, Calfman Hall, had been reopened after undergoing renovations. Before that, it had served as both a dorm and an administrative office. After the remodel, it was turned into offices only, and the upper floors, which had once been dormitories, were locked off to prevent students from accessing them. Terry said it was about halfway through the semester when a student was reported missing. Her friends had gone to campus security before calling the police, hoping she was just hiding out or had gone somewhere without telling anyone. When she couldn't be found, Terry was sent to do a campus-wide search that night. He didn't want to go alone and had urged his supervisors to get the police involved immediately, but they decided to wait until morning. So Terry went alone, searching dorms, buildings, and every dark corner of campus. It was a quiet night, and he had almost completed his sweep when he noticed something odd about Calfman Hall. One of the lights was on in the top floor, a level that was supposed to be locked and vacant. He approached and found the front doors slightly ajar. Again, not something that should have been possible, given that the offices closed at 5 p.m. and the building had been locked for the night. Still, he stepped inside and began his way up the stairs, floor by floor, until he reached the level just beneath the old dormitory. He paused, winded from the climb, when he heard something up above, a door slamming shut. The sound was sharp, definitive, like someone trying to hide or flee. He climbed the final flight and found the locked door that led to the old dormitory corridor. Taking out his key ring, he unlocked it and stepped inside. Everything was dark, the air stale from disuse. Terry walked slowly, shining his flashlight down the long hallway. As he passed the old dorm rooms, he called out the missing girl's name, hoping she would respond. Room by room he peeked in, seeing only dust-covered furniture and sealed windows. Then, halfway down the hall, he heard footsteps, soft at first, then quicker, like someone was running. He rushed back into the hallway, but it was empty. Then, faintly, he heard laughter. Not the kind you'd expect from a college student. It was deep, male, and unsettling. He called out again, asking if anyone was there, and then, at the far end of the hallway, a man appeared, tall, dressed in black, his face obscured in the dim light. Terry shouted at him, asking what he was doing there, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he suddenly broke into a full sprint, straight toward Terry, screaming at the top of his lungs. Terrified, Terry spun around and sprinted back toward the stairwell. He slammed the door shut behind him and locked it, the sound of his own breath loud in his ears. As he took the first few steps down, he heard something on the other side of the door. A laugh. Low, cruel, echoing down the stairwell. Terry didn't stop running until he was back at the security office. He immediately called the police, and a full sweep of the building was done later that night. No one was found. The door to the old dorm floor was still locked from the inside, just as he had left it. But in one of the rooms, the officers found a small cot and a few blankets. Someone had clearly been living there. The university changed the locks after that, and security patrols were increased, but Terry never volunteered to check Calfman Hall again. Strangely enough, the missing girl turned up the next morning. She had left campus to stay with her boyfriend for the weekend after a fight with her roommates and hadn't told anyone. Terry said he was relieved she was safe, but also furious. If she had just said something, none of that would have happened. I asked him what he thought the man in the hallway was. A squatter. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I don't know, but it wasn't someone looking for a place to sleep. That was something else." Years later, I ran into Terry again at a restaurant. He had gone back to being a state trooper by then, and we exchanged a few polite words. I introduced him to some friends, telling them he was the one who had shared the Calfman Hall story. One of them asked him if the man was ever caught. Terry shook his head slowly. Then, after a pause, he said something that made my blood run cold. He told us that around the same time as the incident, one of the top university administrators had a son who had been in and out of psychiatric institutions for most of his life. He was unstable, unpredictable, and had a history of disappearing for days at a time. Terry always suspected that this man had somehow gained access to the old dorm floor, using a copy of the key, or maybe through connections. That maybe he was the one living up there. That maybe he had been watching the campus every night from behind one of those dusty windows. Eventually the son was recommitted to the institution after vanishing again and again. Terry never got confirmation. He didn't want it, and the university never mentioned it publicly. That night in the dorm lobby, I remember feeling like I'd stepped into a different world. One where the safe routines of college life collided with something unexplainable. Terry never spoke of the incident again, at least not to me. Whenever I saw him afterward, we'd chat about sports or the weather, anything else. But I never forgot the look in his eyes when he talked about that hallway. And every time I passed Calfman Hall after dark, I felt something behind those windows, watching silently. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone. Or maybe it was the building itself, remembering. It's story 6. The voice on the line. There was a time in my early 20s when I lived alone in a small apartment and worked night shifts at a call center that handled late night calls for various services, one of which was a 24-hour plumbing company. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. And because of the odd hours, 8 p.m. to about 6 a.m., I was always the only operator in the building. The office was quiet, almost too quiet, with only one overhead light above my desk and the rest of the floor swallowed in shadows. The security guard passed through twice during the night, making his rounds, and aside from that brief interaction, I was left completely alone for 10-hour stretches. I took my meals at the desk, rushed to and from the bathroom with my headset still on, and tried to stay awake by reading, doodling, or occasionally sneaking in a cigarette near the window where I could keep an eye on the computer screen. In the early days, it was just the solitude that I had to manage, battling sleep and boredom. But one night, something changed. Around 2 a.m., I received a call. I answered in my usual chipper tone. "Good evening. Thank you for calling. My name is Jill. How can I help you?" On the other end, there was silence, followed by a low voice repeating my name, Jill, and then the line went dead. I shrugged it off. Night shifts brought out the weirdos sometimes. Drunks, prank callers, or lonely people looking for someone to talk to. But when the call came again a few minutes later, with the same voice repeating my name, I started to feel uneasy. The voice didn't sound playful or drunk. It sounded focused, intentional, and that scared me more than anything. The calls kept coming, each time the same question. "Is this Jill?" Then silence, and then a click. Eventually the voice became bolder, telling me not to be afraid, that he just wanted me to talk to him, that he wouldn't hurt me. I started logging the caller's number and wrote it down on a sticky note, hoping maybe I could report it later. After a while, I stopped answering altogether when I recognized the number, but he must have caught on to that, because he started calling from restricted lines, ones that I couldn't identify, and because I didn't know whether it was a legitimate customer or not, I had no choice but to answer. I would say the company greeting, hear that breath on the other end, and then the voice, so calm, so certain, saying, "Talk to me, I won't hurt you." Night after night, for hours at a time, this voice haunted my shift. I reported the calls to my supervisor, hoping something would be done, but she brushed it off, laughed even, saying the guy didn't know where I was, or who I really was. "He's just a creep on the line," she said. "Ignore it." I didn't feel safe ignoring it. Something about the persistence, the way he knew when I was working and when I wasn't. It all felt too specific. I began switching shifts with co-workers just to see if the pattern held. And sure enough, the caller only ever reached out when I was working. Not a single call came on nights I swapped out or took a sick day. It was like he could see me, like he knew when I was sitting at my desk, completely alone under that one flickering light. I started to get paranoid. My phone was always in my hand on the commute home, emergency number dialed and ready. I walked faster, head down, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Since I wasn't allowed to carry pepper spray, I considered buying a box cutter or something I could keep hidden in my bag, just in case. And every night, as soon as 8 p.m. rolled around, I braced myself for the sound of the phone ringing. Sometimes he called hundreds of times. One night, I counted over 200 calls. It was relentless, like he fed off the idea that I was trapped behind that desk with no escape. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was standing outside the office one evening before my shift, smoking a cigarette like I usually did. The night was still, the kind of silence that makes every movement feel exaggerated. The security guard, the same one I'd nodded at in passing for weeks, approached me and asked for a light. I handed it to him, trying to keep things casual, though I had always found him a bit unsettling. He lit his cigarette, and then, with a strange softness in his voice, told me he had been fired. He said it without any bitterness, like he was letting me in on something he'd known was coming. Then, looking me dead in the eye, he told me he always got the feeling I was afraid of him, that I wasn't friendly or welcoming. And then he said the words that drained every ounce of blood from my body. "I would never hurt you, you know." I stared at him, heart pounding, unable to say anything. He flicked his cigarette, smiled faintly, and walked away into the night. I rushed inside, breathing hard, and told my supervisor everything. She seemed surprised but not shocked. She admitted he'd been fired for making women uncomfortable, harassing them, cornering them in elevators, making inappropriate comments. Apparently the complaints had piled up. I asked for the caller's number. the one I'd written down so many times, and asked if it matched his. She looked at me and simply said, "I threw it away." When I pressed her, she laughed again and asked, "Are you sure it was him? A voice on the phone sounds different, doesn't it?" Her words didn't comfort me. They didn't feel like the words of someone taking my fear seriously, and even though she claimed all calls were recorded for quality assurance, she later admitted the night shifts weren't. Budget cuts. But the strangest part, after he was fired, the calls stopped. Just like that. No tapering off, no last attempt, nothing. They just ceased, as if the phantom had vanished, as if the voice on the line had found its closure or its defeat. I didn't stay much longer at that job. The fear lingered in me, rooted deep, and every night I walked home still half expecting a call, a whisper, or a shadow to follow me from the alley, but it never came. It was over. And yet, in my mind, his voice lingers, low, quiet, persistent, telling me to talk to him, telling me he wouldn't hurt me, over and over again. The voice of someone who knew too much, who watched from too close, and who hid behind the thin veil of a telephone line night after night. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know what he was waiting for. Maybe it was power, maybe it was fear, maybe it was loneliness twisted into obsession. But I know what it did to me. It turned the silence of a night shift into something sinister. It made the glow of a computer screen feel like a spotlight. It made every shadow around my desk feel like it was listening. And now whenever I answer a phone after dark, part of me braces, just in case. Because you never really forget the sound of someone whispering your name through the wire, promising they won't hurt you just before they do. I'm the man in the aisle at 1 a.m. Working the third shift at a big box store isn't exactly glamorous, but for someone like me, a 20-year-old woman who preferred solitude, it was perfect. Most people left me alone, and that was how I liked it. The world slowed down at night and I could focus on my work without too many interruptions. That particular night, I was assigned to the baby section, methodically stocking shelves while listening to a documentary on my earbuds. The store was hushed, with only a few employees scattered throughout the aisles. As I placed pacifiers and baby bottles in neat rows, I noticed a man approaching me. He looked to be in his 50s, with an aging face and a distant look in his eyes. He seemed lost, so I stopped what I was doing and asked if he needed help. He told me he was looking for a baby monitor for his wife and admitted he didn't know anything about them. I guided him to the shelf where they were displayed and began explaining the differences between models: audio only, video native, night vision features, range capacity. I even pulled out my phone to check online reviews and try to offer the most balanced advice I could. He eventually said he'd come back with his wife to decide, thanked me, and I turned to leave. But instead of walking away, he stayed where he was and suddenly launched into a story. He began telling me all about his life, unprompted, like the words had been waiting for an excuse to spill out. He said he'd recently moved here from Florida to take care of his ailing mother, and even told me the street he lived on. His voice was calm, but something about how he hovered felt wrong. He shifted topics abruptly, telling me about how he used to run a furniture business building expensive bedroom sets by hand. Then he pivoted to a story about his ex-wife cheating on him, and how he'd left his job because of it. As I stood there in silence, he continued rambling, sharing far too many personal details for a conversation in a department store at 1 a.m. I barely responded, hoping he'd get the hint and move on. But he didn't seem to notice or care. He talked about a younger woman he had dated afterward, someone he swore he recognized but couldn't place. Eventually he claimed she had been in adult films, and that she'd stolen money from him. He ended the story by saying he would never marry again. I remained polite, nodding occasionally, but inside I was wishing for someone, anyone, to walk past and break the spell of his presence. Then the tone of the conversation shifted. He started talking about a car accident he'd recently been in, about crashing his truck, and how devastated he was over it. His voice trembled slightly, but he quickly assured me he wasn't worried about money. He said he wasn't broke, just didn't want to waste money on something cheap. He made sure I understood that he was financially secure, repeating it multiple times. I hadn't asked. I hadn't even said anything beyond a polite, "Oh." And yet he poured out these fragments of a life I never wanted to know. It felt like he was trying to convince me of something I hadn't questioned, and the unease began to bloom more fully in my chest. He kept inching closer, trying to touch my arm or shoulder every few minutes, and each time I stepped back subtly, trying not to escalate things, but desperate to maintain distance. I looked around frequently, trying to make eye contact with anyone passing by, hoping for a co-worker or even a manager to intervene. But the baby aisle was tucked away, and no one seemed to notice. At one point, a manager walked past the end of the aisle, glanced our way, and continued without stopping. I felt abandoned. The man continued, now telling me he had cancer, but reassured me again, saying it wasn't serious, nothing to worry about. Then he brought up his mother again, saying he didn't care what happened to himself, as long as she stayed healthy. I was trying to keep my breathing steady, forcing myself to nod as though I was listening, while every fibre of my being screamed to run. He wasn't angry, he wasn't threatening, but his presence was suffocating, and I couldn't make him leave. What came next chilled me to the bone. He casually mentioned that he had been arrested recently, framed by a relative who put pills in his car so he couldn't claim inheritance money. Then, as if remembering a footnote in a story, he said he had actually spent 35 years in prison for money stuff. That admission came so casually, so calmly, that I almost thought I'd misheard him. But he continued, talking about his past, his regrets, his isolation. I realized then that something wasn't adding up. He claimed he was 50 years old and had spent 35 years in prison. That would mean he was incarcerated at 15. Something that strained belief considering the crimes he implied. At this point, the timeline didn't make sense, and everything he had said before began to feel like a constructed narrative, riddled with cracks and red flags. Thankfully at that moment, 2 male co-workers came down the aisle on their way to lunch. The man instantly quieted and took a step back. Without another word he nodded to me, muttered an excuse and walked away. My co-workers asked if I was okay, and I nodded, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or shake it off. But I knew one thing for certain: I had no idea what that man wanted. But it wasn't a baby monitor. That entire story, that monologue of misfortune, secrets, and oversharing, was never about conversation. It was a trap, a test, a way to pull me in, to study how I'd respond. And I hated how long I had stood there, frozen by uncertainty, too polite to walk away, too afraid to challenge him directly. Later, as I replayed the conversation in my head, I realized more strange details. He had never mentioned a child, never said who the baby monitor was for. He had spoken about a wife, then an ex-wife, then a girlfriend, then his mother, but never once a child. The item he used to start the conversation was just a pretext, a thread to pull me close, and it worked. I told my co-workers everything, and they made me promise that if I was ever late for break again, they would come check on me just in case. I appreciated it more than I could say. That kind of small gesture, someone showing up, was all I had needed that night. I haven't seen him since. Maybe he was just lonely. Maybe he was high. Maybe he was something else entirely. But I now moved differently through the store. Eyes always scanning. Mind always measuring distance. There's a new rule we've created quietly between ourselves. If you see someone lingering too long, if you feel something in your gut you can't explain, you don't ignore it, you walk together, you interrupt, you check in, because sometimes the scariest people don't shout or chase. They just linger, they just talk, and they wait for a moment when you're too polite to walk away. Story 8. The locked unit at the retirement home. I used to work the night shift at a retirement home tucked deep in a wooded part of the state, a quiet place where time seemed to move slower and the air always carried the faint scent of pine and old books. My position was simple enough: security and nighttime oversight, making sure no residents wandered off and nothing unusual occurred after visiting hours were over. For the most part, it was a peaceful job. Residents were kind, staff were dependable, and nothing much ever happened. But there was one part of the facility I hated: Building C. It had once been a long-term care wing, but after a fire 10 years earlier, the upper floor was closed off permanently. Rumour had it that someone had died up there, but management never confirmed the story. All I knew was that the top floor had been sealed, and staff didn't like talking about it. My nightly rounds included walking through the first floor of Building C, checking all the exterior doors, and ensuring that the elevator was off. The elevator, though, had a mind of its own. It was supposed to be disabled, powered down completely with the breaker off, but several times during my shift, I would hear it hum to life. Sometimes it would open on its own. Once, I saw it slowly descend from the second floor, empty, despite there being no way for anyone to access the locked upper level. Every time I brought it up, I was told it was just a wiring issue. Old building quirks, they'd say. But the longer I worked there, the harder it became to believe that explanation. The elevator wasn't just moving at random. It moved at the same times. Late into the night, always around 3:30, 3 a.m., as if it were on a schedule no one had set. The first time I saw something truly disturbing, I had just finished checking the north hallway and was walking back toward the central atrium when the elevator door slid open behind me. I turned instinctively and saw a woman standing inside, tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned hospital gown. Her hair was white and she stood completely still, facing me but with her head tilted slightly to the left. I froze. No one was supposed to be up there. I had checked all the stairwell access points and they were locked from both sides. Before I could speak, the lights in the elevator flickered once and the door slowly closed. I ran over, slapped the elevator button and waited. When the doors reopened, the car was empty. There were no footprints on the dust-covered floor, no indication that anyone had been inside. I reviewed the camera footage, desperate for an explanation. But the strange thing was, the cameras never caught the elevator doors opening. They showed me turning to look, showed me running toward the elevator, but the doors themselves never moved in the footage. It was like a scene had been deleted. Like the building had chosen what to reveal and what to hide. When I reported it, the facilities manager shook his head and muttered something about phantom glitch. He clearly didn't want to discuss it further. After that night, I avoided Building C whenever I could, but my job required me to return. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent the strange activity became. One night, as I walked past the central nurses' station, I heard soft footsteps overhead. Slow, shuffling movements directly above me on the locked floor. I radioed my supervisor and asked if anyone else was on site. She confirmed that I was the only one assigned to that wing. Still, I climbed the staircase with my key in hand, unlocked the top floor door, and stepped into silence. The air was cold, unnaturally so, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees the moment I crossed the threshold. The floor was dusty, unused, with sheets still draped over old furniture and medical equipment. I shined my flashlight down the hallway and saw nothing at first, just empty rooms and forgotten machines. But then I noticed a chair at the end of the hallway, slowly spinning in place, as if someone had just stood up from it seconds before. I stood completely still, listening for any sound, any hint of movement, but the hallway remained silent. As I stepped forward, my foot brushed against something small, a rubber ball, pale pink, slightly worn. It rolled gently across the floor and bumped into the far wall, coming to rest at the base of an open doorway. I hadn't seen it earlier. I couldn't explain how it had gotten there. The doors at the far end were still sealed, and there were no gaps in the floor where it could have fallen through. I backed out of the hallway, slowly, heart thudding in my chest, and locked the door behind me. I didn't report what I saw. I couldn't, not without sounding like I had lost my grip on reality. But the most disturbing experience happened just a few weeks later. I was doing my rounds when I heard the intercom buzz to life in Building C, a system that hadn't been used since the fire. A low static crackled, followed by a voice, faint, strained, whispering my name. Alex, it said, long and drawn out, as if spoken through a broken speaker. I froze, staring at the intercom speaker above the nurse's station. Then the voice spoke again. "Why did you leave me?" it asked. The words slow, mournful, filled with something that sounded like betrayal. I ran out of the building and called the main desk, demanding to know if anyone had accessed the old intercom controls. They told me it was impossible. The system had been shut down for years. After that, I refused to enter Building C alone. I demanded to be paired with another staff member or reassigned entirely. Management wasn't happy, but they agreed to rotate the schedule. Eventually, I left the job. I couldn't take the toll it was taking on my sleep, my sanity, but that building, I still think about it. About the woman in the elevator, about the voice calling my name, about the spinning chair and the rubber ball. I don't know what happened in that upper floor, whether it was trauma, tragedy, or something darker, but whatever it was, it didn't stay buried. It lingers in the walls, in the air, in the patterns of machinery that should have stopped working long ago. Sometimes I wonder who she was. The woman in the elevator. Was she a patient, a nurse, a remnant of the fire's past? I wonder what she wanted. If she was trying to tell me something, or if I was just unlucky enough to notice her when others didn't. People don't like to talk about that wing. They joke about it, yes, but deep down, I think they know something's wrong with that floor. Something that didn't end with the fire, something that never left. And now, whenever I pass an old elevator, hear a faint buzz on a quiet speaker, or see a spinning chair out of the corner of my eye, I remember her. I remember Building C. And I remember that some doors are locked, not to keep us out, but to keep something else in. Story 9. The Night Manager's Reflection. During college, I took a job as a night manager at a modest chain motel just off the interstate, a place where truckers came to rest. Families passed through on road trips, and traveling salesmen vanished behind numbered doors. The pay wasn't great, but the shifts were quiet and mostly uneventful. It was the kind of job where you could sit behind the front desk with a coffee, catch up on homework, and only occasionally be interrupted by a late check-in or someone asking for extra towel. The motel had been around since the 70s. A low, flat building with long exterior corridors and rooms that faced out into the parking lot. The lobby was simple, the kind of place where artificial plants and faded paintings tried to give guests a sense of warmth. I worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and for the most part I was alone, with only the quiet hum of vending machines and the occasional distant television providing any hint of life. I'd been working there for a few months when the strange occurrences began. At first it was subtle. The security monitor at the front desk showed live feeds from a handful of cameras, mostly just views of the parking lot, the lobby and the narrow hallway behind the reception area. I'd glance up from time to time, usually just to check if anyone was approaching the front door. But one night, while sipping coffee and scrolling through a textbook, I noticed something odd on the monitor. In the footage of the rear hallway, a man was standing still, facing away from the camera. His posture was rigid, his arms at his sides. I stared at the screen for nearly a minute, confused. No one should have been back there. That hallway led only to the staff storage room and the mechanical closet. Guests had no reason to be back there. I got up quickly, peeked around the corner, and saw nothing. The hallway was empty. Thinking it was a glitch, I checked the monitor again, but the man was still there, standing in the exact same spot, unmoving. I looked again, this time with my heart beating just a little faster. The hallway remained empty. The camera feed, however, continued to show the figure. I tried switching angles, resetting the feed, but the image didn't change. Eventually, the man simply vanished. The screen flickered slightly, and the hallway returned to normal. I told myself it was a technical bug. The system was old after all. But in the weeks that followed, the image returned, sometimes for seconds, sometimes for nearly half an hour. Always the same man, always standing still, always facing away. It became a ritual. Each shift, I would glance up at the feed, hoping not to see him. Some nights, the screen would stay clean, uneventful. Other times, he'd be there already when I arrived, waiting. His presence began to get under my skin. One night, I thought I'd be clever and sneak a mirror back there, positioning it in a way that the camera might catch his face if he ever turned. I spent nearly an hour adjusting it, making sure it was angled correctly. When I returned to the monitor, I waited, heart thudding. At 2:12 a.m. he appeared again, only this time the mirror didn't show a reflection. Where his face should have been, there was nothing. Just an empty stretch of wall, as if light itself avoided revealing him. I left the mirror there for the rest of my shift, and never tried that again. As time passed, the disturbances escalated. The lobby lights would flicker between 3 and 4 a.m., always at the same time the man appeared on screen. Doors in unoccupied rooms would open on their own, checked, confirmed locked, only to be found wide open minutes later. Guests started commenting on odd sounds at night, knocking on walls, tapping at windows. Voices they couldn't quite place. One trucker approached the desk, looking pale, and asked if we had any staff in room 1-3, the one directly next to his. I told him no, the room was vacant and had been all night. He just nodded slowly and muttered, "Guess I imagined it," before walking back out into the darkness. I checked the key logs. No one had entered that room. And yet, the next morning, the bed had an imprint, as if someone had lain there for hours. One early morning, after a particularly long shift, I was preparing to log out when the monitor flickered violently. Every camera went black for several seconds, then rebooted, except for the rear hallway feed. That one showed me, sitting at the front desk, but I was moving. I was frozen, eyes wide, staring straight ahead. The strange part? I was relaxed, leaning on my elbow, sipping coffee, but the image showed a rigid, wide-eyed version of me, staring into the camera like I was seeing something behind it. I stood up, waved at the feed, but the version of me on screen didn't move. Then, slowly, it began to smile, a wide, unnatural grin. I unplugged the monitor and sat in silence until the sun rose. I told the manager about it the next day, half expecting to be laughed at, but instead she grew quiet. She said she'd worked at another location years ago and had seen strange things there too. She said some of these motels, the older ones especially, collect stories, collect energy. She didn't say much more, just gave me a long look and asked if I wanted to switch to daytime hours. I considered it, but part of me was too curious. I stayed on nights. I told myself I'd figure it out, find a pattern, discover some hidden truth about the man on the monitor and the reflection that wasn't mine. Then came the final night. I was sitting at the desk, listening to the soft rain outside when the phone rang. I answered with the usual greeting, but no one responded. Just breathing. Heavy, slow breathing. Then, faintly, the voice said, "You shouldn't have watched." I tried to trace the call. It was coming from inside the motel, from the line in the manager's office, which I knew was locked. I stood, keys in hand, and walked to the office, unlocked it and turned on the light. The phone sat on the desk, untouched. But on the screen of the security monitor inside the office was the same hallway camera, still showing the man, still standing there. Only now, he was facing the camera, and he had my face. I left that night and never went back. I quit the next morning. The manager didn't ask questions. She just nodded and said, "It gets to some people more than others." I never learnt who the man was or why he appeared. I don't know if he was ever real or just something that crept into the system over time, growing stronger with each glance. But I do know this. Sometimes things see you when you see them, and sometimes what you think is just a harmless security feed is really a mirror, one that doesn't show what you are, but what's waiting behind you. Story 10. The third door on the left. When I was 21, I took a job as an overnight janitor at a small private school tucked deep in a quiet suburb. The building had once been a mansion in the 1800s, later converted into a school for gifted children, and finally renovated into a modern charter academy. Despite the polished floors, fluorescent lights, and updated computer labs, there was no hiding the building's age. The walls creaked when the wind blew. The hallways carried echoes too well. And in the dead hours of the night, when everyone had gone home and I was alone with my cart and my mop, the place seemed to revert to its past self. The silence wasn't empty. It was observant. I knew this early on, but like most people working night shifts in odd places, I ignored the feeling and told myself it was just in my head. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ran to 6 a.m., with the first half spent cleaning classrooms and common areas, and the latter half dedicated to restrooms and deeper sanitizing. The school had 3 floors, one for the main classrooms, another for administration, and the topmost floor, mostly locked, used for storage. I was only required to clean the first 2, and I liked it that way. But the third floor always felt like it was waiting. It had wide wooden staircases that groaned with every step and long hallways with tall doors, all locked, except for one, the third door on the left. I had asked about it once, early in my first week, and the head custodian had simply said, "Don't worry about that one, it's been that way for years." He never explained what he meant, and I never pressed. One night, sometime around 2:30 a.m., I was mopping the second floor hallway when I heard what I thought was a piano note, soft, singular, faint. It echoed down from above, like a distant sound carried on an empty breeze. I paused, mop mid-air, and listened. Another note, then another. A slow, gentle sequence of music coming from the top floor. I knew there was no piano in the building. The only one the school had was on the first floor, locked in the music room, and I had just cleaned it 30 minutes earlier. I stood still, every hair on my arms rising, and listened until the notes faded into silence. I didn't go upstairs that night. I didn't even look up the stairwell. I finished my cleaning and left quickly, trying not to imagine old fingers on ivory keys in a room no one used anymore. A week passed before anything happened again. I was in the janitor's closet, changing out a mop head, when the intercom crackled. It hadn't worked in years. Everyone used walkie-talkies or phones now. But that night, it came alive with a whisper, soft but sharp. It didn't say my name. It didn't say anything coherent. It just breathed. A long, dry inhale followed by the click of the system shutting off. I reported it the next morning, and the day staff told me it must have been a power surge or a glitch in the wiring. But I could tell they didn't believe that. They exchanged looks, quick, quiet ones. I wasn't the first to hear something. Soon after, the door on the third floor began to change. I noticed it during one of my walks between rooms. It had always been closed. Always. But that night, it was open just a crack, enough to show a sliver of shadowed room beyond it. I approached slowly, my cleaning rag still in my hand, heart thudding. I leaned in, looked through the gap. The room was empty. Dusty shelves, covered furniture, old chalkboard stacked against the walls, but the air coming from inside felt colder than the hallway. Thick, heavy, like it hadn't been breathed in years. I pushed the door gently until it clicked shut. When I returned the next night, it was cracked again. It began happening regularly after that. Sometimes I would find the door wide open. Other times, just enough for a narrow shadow to slip through. Once, I swear I saw movement, a figure shifting quickly out of sight the moment I looked in. I tried reporting it again, but the head custodian shrugged and said, "You really shouldn't be up there." It wasn't a warning, it was advice. Firm, quiet advice. I followed it for a while. I avoided the third floor, made up excuses to skip that end of the building. But one night, I made the mistake of going up again, just to check, just to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The door was open when I arrived, wide open, and inside, the furniture was rearranged. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing the door. On it, a mirror, an old, tarnished mirror I hadn't seen before. I stepped inside, slowly. The air was thick, humid now, like breath had warmed it for hours. I approached the mirror, expecting to see my reflection, but the glass was dim, cloudy. When I wiped the surface with my rag, my reflection looked back at me, but not as I was. I was older, greyer, thinner, wearing a uniform I didn't own. My mouth opened, but I didn't speak. The image raised its hand, touched the glass from the inside. I dropped the rag, backed out of the room and fled down the stairs 2 at a time. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't tell anyone, I couldn't. The next night, I came in early, determined to avoid the third floor altogether. But the moment I walked in, the hallway lights on the second floor went out. Only those. All others in the building stayed on. I checked the breaker, everything was normal, but those lights stayed off the entire night. The dark seemed to lean in from every corner, thick and creeping. I cleaned as fast as I could, skipping corners, rushing through tasks, and left without looking back. For the rest of my time there, I never went up to the third floor again. I pretended it didn't exist. I avoided its gaze, its sound, its presence. When I finally quit, I asked the day staff if they knew anything about that door, that room, that mirror. One of the older teachers pulled me aside. She said the third floor had once been a music conservatory. A child prodigy had studied there, gifted but deeply disturbed. They say she practiced alone, refused company, and stared at herself in the mirror for hours while she played. One night she vanished. Locked door, untouched room, no sign of struggle. All they found was her music notebook on the floor, its last page filled with frantic, overlapping notes, and one word repeated again and again: listen. After that, the school closed off the room, but sometimes the door forgets to stay closed. Story 11. The overnight gas station shift. When I was 19, I took a job at a 24-hour gas station in the rural part of our county, miles away from the nearest town, nestled between long stretches of highway and empty farmland. The kind of place truckers stopped for coffee and locals filled up their tanks on the way into the city. The store was small, just 2 aisles, a cash register, and a break room in the back that doubled as a storage closet. The pay was decent for someone my age, and since the night shifts were always hard to fill, I got all the hours I wanted. I liked the quiet, at least at first. The nights were predictable. Clean the counters, stock the drinks, watch the clock. But after a few months, I realized that the isolation, once peaceful, had begun to feel like something else, like the silence was listening. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. Most nights, I'd get maybe 10 customers, mostly truckers or shift workers, the occasional teenager sneaking in to buy snacks. They'd come and go quickly, and then the store would return to stillness, the hum of the coolers the only sound. It was during one of those empty stretches, sometime around 2:30 in the morning, that I noticed the man. He was standing just outside the store, not near the pumps or the parking lot, but off to the side, near the shadows of the trees. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. His silhouette was tall, shoulders hunched forward slightly, arms dangling at his sides. I thought maybe he was waiting for someone, or needed help, so I opened the door and called out. No response. He didn't even move, just stood there in the dark. I waited another minute, then stepped outside a few feet. The night was dead silent. No wind, no crickets, no engine sounds. The man remained still. Something about his posture made me uneasy, like he wasn't confused or in distress, but completely focused on me. I went back inside, locked the door, and watched from the register. After a few minutes, he walked away, slowly, casually, disappearing behind the side of the building. I checked the cameras but didn't see him again. It was strange, but I chalked it up to a local with poor social skills, or maybe someone passing through on foot. Still, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, unmoving, watching like he had all the time in the world. A week passed before anything else happened. I had almost forgotten about the man when, during another late-night lull, I heard a knock at the back door, the one that led into the storage hallway behind the cooler. No one ever used that door. It stayed locked from the inside, and only the manager had a key. I froze, unsure of what I'd heard. Then, another knock, softer this time, but deliberate. I crept toward the back hallway, flashlight in hand, and peeked around the corner. The door was shut. Nothing moved. I waited, holding my breath. Then, a whisper. Faint, just one word. Please. I flipped on the hallway light, threw open the back door, and was met with nothing but the night air and an empty loading space. No footsteps, no voice, no sign that anyone had been there at all. That was when I started checking the cameras more frequently. I asked the day shift manager if we had any footage of the previous week, just in case someone had been lurking behind the building. She said the system was glitchy at night. Some of the cameras went black for hours at a time. I reviewed the files myself, and, sure enough, the footage from the time of the knock was missing. Corrupted, apparently. As the nights continued, the disturbances grew. Items would fall from shelves with no one nearby. The lights above the counter would flicker even though the bulbs were new. The bathroom door would creak open on its own, slow and deliberate. I tried to stay rational, tried to explain it away with electrical faults and old building quirks. But every night, I felt watched. One night, just past 3 a.m., I was restocking the refrigerator when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, reflected in the glass of the cooler. He was inside the store. I turned sharply, heart pounding, but the room was empty. I rushed to the front door, still locked. I checked the aisles, nothing. But when I returned to the register, a single candy bar had been placed on the counter, perfectly centered. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't even touched the candy section that night. I watched the cameras again, replayed every angle, but the footage skipped during the minute it must have appeared. Just a burst of static, then back to normal. Another time I heard the sound of footsteps on the roof. It started as a soft thud, like someone had dropped something above the ceiling tiles, then a slow, dragging step, pacing back and forth. The roof was flat, accessible only by a locked exterior ladder. I called the police, told them someone might be trying to break in. They came, did a full sweep, and found nothing. No footprints, no signs of tampering. They asked if I'd imagined it. I told them I hadn't. One of the officers, older, with lines etched deep in his face, looked at me for a long time before saying quietly, "This place has always been odd. That was all he offered before leaving. The last straw came during a lightning storm. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled endlessly, and the store lights kept dimming like they were about to go out. I was counting bills at the register when the power surged, and the entire store went dark for just a second. When the lights returned, the man was standing just outside the glass door. Not at the edge of the lot, not in the shadows, right inches from the entrance. His face was gaunt, pale, eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't try to enter, just stood, staring. I backed away slowly, heart racing. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't move. I watched him for what felt like an hour. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the lights flickered again and he was gone. I quit the next morning. I didn't explain much, just said I needed to focus on school. The manager didn't argue. She nodded like she had heard it before, like she understood, and maybe she did. That gas station still stands, still lights up the night for the occasional traveller. But I won't go back, not even to buy a bottle of water. I don't care if the coffee's good or the prices are cheap, because I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know that somewhere out there, just beyond the edge of that building, something waits in the dark. Not to harm, not to speak, but simply to be seen. Over and over again. Story 12. The security office that watched back. A few years ago, I worked overnight security at a small office complex tucked away in an industrial park. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten after 5 p.m. Rows of darkened windows, locked doors and motion-activated lights that flickered to life with the slightest movement. My job was straightforward. Make rounds every couple of hours, check the locks and monitor the security feeds from a cramped little room near the main entrance. There was rarely any activity, and I liked it that way. I brought a thermos of coffee, a few books, and the comfort of knowing the building was mine after dark. At least, that's how I thought of it in the beginning. Before I realized that the building might have had other ideas. The cameras were dated, grainy black and white feeds that made everything look older than it really was. There were 12 of them in total, watching hallways, stairwells, parking lots and service doors. Most nights, I would flip through the feeds during the first hour of my shift, then again just before sunrise. The screens crackled occasionally, but I always blamed it on aging wires or spotty connections. Nothing ever seemed out of place until one particular Tuesday, when I noticed something strange in camera 6, the east hallway leading to the disused mail room. There, at the far end of the corridor, stood a figure, just a silhouette, unmoving, facing the wall. I squinted at the screen, confused. No one should have been there. That hallway wasn't used anymore. I pressed the button to zoom the feed slightly. The figure didn't move, didn't sway. I flipped to the other cameras to get a different angle, but none of them showed anything unusual. When I returned to camera 6, the figure was gone. I told myself it had been a trick of the shadows, maybe a coat rack or mop bucket left behind. During my next round, I walked the east hallway myself. My flashlight beam danced across the empty walls and tile floor. No figures, no obstructions, nothing at all. But I still felt watched, like the camera had seen something I wasn't supposed to witness. Over the next week, the figure returned on and off, never at the same time, never doing anything but standing still. Sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always facing the wall. I started documenting it, writing down times, dates, screen captures. But the images didn't always save correctly. The files were either corrupted or completely blank. I called the tech support line for the camera system, but the man on the phone just said, "Yeah, we've had reports like that before," and then the call dropped. When I called back, I was rerouted to a new operator who insisted there had never been an issue with that model. I started to wonder if I was losing track of time, if long hours and lack of sleep were finally catching up with me. Then came the night it moved. I had just returned from my second walk of the building. Everything had been normal. I sat down, poured another cup of coffee, and checked the feeds. The figure was there again, on camera 6, only this time it was facing the camera. I could make out no details, no face, just the shape of a head, shoulders, arms, standing, perfectly centered in the hallway, as if it had been waiting for me. I stared, frozen, my coffee cooling in my hand. Then, slowly, the figure took a step forward. Not toward the wall this time, but directly toward the lens. I stood up, heart hammering, unsure whether to run to the hallway or away from it. But I couldn't look away from the screen. The figure took another step, and another. It was maybe 20 feet from the camera now. Still no features, just dark space where a face should have been. I switched to camera 7, which covered the same hall from the opposite side. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I switched back. The figure was closer. I switched again. Still nothing. It was like it only existed inside that one camera. Or worse, like it existed only when I looked at it. I summoned the courage to check the hallway myself. I grabbed the flashlight, radioed in a quick status update, and began walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the east corridor, it was empty, still, silent. But the air felt off, thick, like it was holding its breath. I turned my flashlight toward the camera, expecting to see some hint of movement, some sign of what I had just witnessed, but there was nothing. No figure. No person. Only the sound of the lights buzzing faintly overhead, and my own footsteps echoing in the quiet. The next day, I reviewed the footage from the previous night. All of it was gone. Not just camera 6, but the entire recording from midnight to 3 a.m. on all feeds. I called my supervisor and asked if there had been a glitch. He said no, that the system had reported no errors. When I told him what I saw, he went quiet, then said, "We've had a few guys see things on that feed. It's why no one sticks around long on third shift." That night, I returned to work with a different mindset, no longer relaxed, no longer comforted by solitude. I kept the lights on in the security room. I kept every camera open. And I didn't look at camera 6 unless I had to. But the figure still came. Every night. Closer. Sharper. Once, I swear I saw its hand reach toward the lens. Another time, I saw its reflection on the monitor glass, moving even when the image on screen was still. I finally quit after my last night there, when the power flickered and every monitor blinked off except camera 6. The screen lit up with that hallway, completely dark. The emergency lights hadn't kicked in yet, but I could see the figure standing inches from the lens, watching, waiting. It raised a hand. Then the screen went black. I don't know what it was. I don't think it wanted to hurt me, but I know it knew I was there. I know it watched me watching it. And I believe even now that somewhere deep in the static of old wires and dusty screens, something still stands in that hallway. Something that doesn't show up unless you look directly at it. And when you do, it gets closer. Not out of malice, but out of memory. Because once you've seen it, you're part of its loop and it waits patiently for your return.